What's happening, buddy? This is Hayden Adams with The Designer Who Codes. This is a multi-part video series where I'm making and I'm focusing on Bootstrap Flex. In the previous videos, which I will link to down below, I focused on rows, columns, common inline flex, and finished up with justifying content. I specifically wanted to separate these two videos because this can be more of a head twister. The justify content from the previous video focuses on rows using the x-axis, and the justify content with columns using the y-axis. Well, this one's now going to focus on the rows and the y and the columns on the x. So with that, let's get started. Down below, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down the page. I'm going to build something brand new. Just to keep these things really consistent so we're not getting confused, I'm going to type something. I'm going to say H2, and down here, the justify is now going to be align items. And here, the row, well, let's not put a zero, let's put a dash. I'm going to say row, and just to make sure it's not confusing from the justified section, I'm going to say row y-axis, because now we're going to move the rows up and down. If I save this one, now we're going to have it right down below. Because the y-axis has to have space, I've built a vertical box which has the min height being at 600 pixels. I'm going to come back down here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to type something manual just for a quick second, then I'll copy in those I'm a div page. What I'm going to do is I'll say div, and in this area I'm going to say D, let's say class first. I'll say D-LG flex. I do want to make this responsive. I'm going to say now vertical box. What's going to happen is if I just select the word test just for a quick second, what I should get perfect is the word test inside this area. Now I'm going to do is I'm going to add I'm a div 3 times over. So I'll copy and paste, copy and paste, and copy and paste. Now what's going to happen is because the box is so big vertically, the divs also go down that low. So if we want to start aligning things to the box vertically, what we have to do is now say align items, and then we have to go with start, end, and or center for the first 3. So if I say align items and we'll say start, not state, let's try start, it'll align them to the top of the page in the top left. Now don't think about the x-axis, but again, the y-axis. So what we have to do now is then say if we want to go to the end of the page or the very bottom, we can say align items end. And now what's going to happen is, minus the scrolling effect, the row y-axis will get pushed down to the very bottom. And you guessed it, if I say center, align item center, what's going to happen is, minus the scrolling effect, now we notice that those boxes stay in the middle of the box vertically. Now we don't have what we had before, which we had them separate across the page in the x-axis, but we have it where you can then pull it down to a baseline or a stretch. So what this will do is you really can only get 3, but the stretch will go back to that full size distance to stretch the boxes down to the bottom of the page. This can be good because if I were to say I'm a div, and let's just copy and paste this like 4 or 5 times, what's gonna, well, actually that will happen. I should have put a break tag. Let's actually do this. Let's put a BR in there just because I needed a second row of type. If we go back to the start, notice now how each box is not the same height. So if we want to vertically align these boxes so this div box becomes lined down here, this is where this extra element comes into play, which is stretch. So again, what I can do is I can change a line item start to a line items stretch. Now because the vertical box is right here, it'll then stretch it all the way down to its parent. Since we don't need that vertical box in this instance, I'll take it out. And now what's going to happen is now both boxes are evenly aligned to the bottom versus if I were to say start, notice how this goes back to its original location. So you may or may not need that vertical box depending upon how you want to use the align items to the row. I'm going to bring it back just because we can see the boxes being then, we're going to put it back to the center right in here. So now that we did the align items row to the Y axis, we now have to then focus on, like we had before, the align items to the columns, which will then be the X axis. So it's going to flip it on its head. So what I'm going to do down here is I'll say H2 and we'll say align items, columns, and this will be the X axis. So in here, we're going to do is a couple things to our div. I'm going to say div class, and I'll say DLG flex, and then we're going to say flex column. We'll just save it for right now. And we'll bring those three, I'm a div, I'm a div, I'm a div. And there and there. And now we should have is down here our three columns. Now we have to then bring our vertical box in for this just to kind of have our columns be more column style. So we'll bring our vertical box, drop it in. And now we can do is we can move this around on the X axis. And when we do that, these columns will then become more of a span versus a div in this respect. So I'm going to say align items start in here. And now what happens is these boxes will expand only to the width of the content inside of them. And now we're on the left-hand side / the start. If I want to go end, the same way also happens where it's going to bring it over here to the right or the end side. And then I'm going to say center, and the same thing approaches in this direction. So this is how you can align the align item center, start, and end with the columns. Now, again, I try to think about them in this respect because it does get confusing at times. If you think about it, columns X, row Y, and then columns Y, row X. How I think about these two sections, like think about, do I need rows or do I need columns? If it's columns, then I'm focused on justify Y, and then down here, align becomes the X axis. If it's rows I need, like this one right here, I think of align being to the Y and justify being to the X. That's the two pieces I look at. I try not to combine the Y, X, X, Y too much because it gets confusing. That's also why I wanted to make two videos. One just on justify, and one on the align for row and columns.